For this session, I want to talk to you about photographing dogs on the beach. So this is a shoot from a few years back with me and my friend, and we both have two dogs. This white dog here is mine, and this is her dog, Betty. Now, I started this demo on this photo to show you how when taking one photo, so when recording one light level in your photo, will quite often be good for one dog, but not great for the other. So it's great for Eva. You can see all of her detail. You can see all the water droplets. She's got detail in her fur. The white isn't blown out on her back or on the top of her head. But you can't see much detail in Betty. Her eye is, you just cannot see it. So the reason for this is because your camera records one light level, and when it's quite bright, say for example, you have a look at this photo, it's very bright behind. Now that's because I've told the camera to take the photo brighter to give me the detail in my dog here, so we can see her eyes and her mouth and her harness. Now this isn't the sharpest shot, so we can look at this one that's a bit sharper. Okay, so we can see the detail better in this one. Now these are all raw files, they're all unedited, and it's good to show you these because there's not a high hit rate in your photos generally when you shoot. So it's very difficult to get 100% excellent photos every time you shoot. So don't worry if you take 100 photos and you only use 10 of them. That's pretty good for a hit rate. Okay, so what I mean by hit rate is usable photos. So there are going to be lots of overexposed, underexposed, out of focus kind of shots in here because we're photographing a moving subject and we're using different exposures to try and get the detail in the darker dogs and then in the brighter dogs, depending on where they're stood in relation to the sun. There's a lot going on and everything's very fast moving. So this is a typical kind of shot or a typical kind of photo shoot that you would see for this kind of subject. So for this shot, I've overexposed my photo to get the detail in the dog, but because the background was very bright, the background has also overexposed. So this is a real consideration when you're photographing dogs on the beach. If you have a contrasty day, so a very bright sky, you will find that you can lose detail in your dog if your sun, your light source, is positioned opposite to you, so the other side of the dog. Now, if I hadn't overexposed to get the detail in her, my photo would look more like this, where we lose some of that detail. Okay, so we can't see much in her. We can see a little bit of detail in Betty's face because she's lying down and some of the light's coming down and hitting the top of her face here. But it's not as much detail as this one where we've kind of overexposed on purpose. So what can you do? So when you are out photographing on the beach, it's important to look at where your light is coming from. And if you can, photograph with the light behind you so that it falls on your subject from the angle that you are shooting your subject. Now let's see if we can find an example of that. And you can look at shadows as well. I'm going to give you a rough idea of where the light's falling. She's so cute, isn't she? Let's have a look and see if we can find one with better light direction. So here we've got a bright sky behind. This one's okay. Got a softer light in this photo, so the sun would have been behind some clouds. But you can still see that we've got this difference in tone. So where Molly's coat is darker here, it really contrasts with the bright sand behind. But we've still got a nice amount of detail in there because it's not a really hard contrast compared to something like this, where there's a real hard contrast. This could almost be a backlit studio background. So that's a real consideration. Where you stand is really important when you take your photos. Now, where I have my camera set up for this sort of scene, and then I switch to photograph my white dog, you can see the difference in the detail. Yeah, so this photo here is set up with the settings to photograph my black dog. So we get all the detail in here. Then this dog comes into the scene. I take the same photo without changing my settings, and we get an overexposed dog. Okay. Now there is a certain amount of detail you can bring back in Lightroom. And Lightroom is really, really good at doing this, especially if you have shot in RAW. So here, .nef, this is a Nikon RAW file format. So I'll be able to bring some detail back in here. But ideally, you want to shoot a little bit darker so that you can get that detail in there. Okay. And remember to change your settings in between shot. So if you're in full manual mode and manual ISO, your settings will stay fixed. If you use auto ISO, your exposure will balance for you, but you do still need to keep an eye on your photos once you've taken them. Zoom in and check for detail, because your camera doesn't always get it right. Your camera is designed to give you an average exposure value based on your entire scene, and quite often that can look like this. Maybe you have a bright background, or it might look like this, where actually the dog's a little bit too dark. Yeah, it just depends on your scene and where your light is coming from. So your camera's not always going to give you the best result, which is why it's really worth learning how to use exposure compensation, or in manual mode you can adjust your settings accordingly. But for this sort of subject, I would advise shutter priority and exposure compensation, so your camera settings are balancing for you. Now for this shot, ideally I wanted to shoot at +1 just to give us a bit more detail in the dog, but again that would make the background brighter like they have in the other ones. But that's kind of just a trade-off between having the correct exposure on your dog or having the correct exposure on the background. Now what you could do is you could edit this later on. So if you are shooting in RAW, you're still going to have a lot of detail in these darker areas, and you can bring up the shadow slider in Lightroom, and that's going to give you a bit more detail in your shadow areas. On the flip side, you could bring the highlight slider down on a brighter shot, but it's a lot harder to bring back highlight detail compared to bringing up shadow detail. So bear that in mind. It's always better to underexpose slightly than it is to overexpose. In an ideal world, we'll have a nice even light where we don't have to worry about bringing the shadow slider up or the highlight slider down, but that's not always the case. This shot is pretty even in terms of exposure. The dog hasn't got any blown highlights, and the sand is pretty flat in terms of the light as well. So this shot we could play with quite nicely and get quite a nice result without having to worry too much about shadows and highlights being blown. Now there are different ways that you can autofocus when you photograph moving subjects, and some cameras are better than others at focusing quickly. So you can choose your autofocus mode, you can choose your autofocus area, and you can also decide if you want to track your subject or if you just want to focus once and take a photo once. There's lots of different ways that you can set your autofocus settings up, and they also change depending on whether you're using live view or not using live view. Now, generally speaking, if you're at the beach and it is a bright day, it's going to be hard for you to see your screen. So I wouldn't recommend just using the screen to take your shots. I would recommend using the viewfinder to put the camera to your face. Now, I know this can be a little bit difficult for people who haven't got a great sight, or people who wear glasses don't want to have to constantly take their glasses on and off. So just do what works for you. But bear in mind as well, if you can use your viewfinder, it just helps you get your framing a little bit better. And yeah, it just cuts down on glare on the screen. So it's a good thing to use. What else can we think about? So we've got those shots. So so autofocus. So some cameras will let you track, and some cameras will also let you track eyes. And they can be as specific as left eye, right eye. I think that's a bit much, to be fair, but camera manufacturers like to show off with these things. To be honest, I found that using a servo mode, so basically that's a Canon mode for following animals, or you also have AFC, which is continuous focus, combined with tracking, is okay. It works some of the time, but on a lot of cameras, it's not really quick enough to keep up with your subject. So the exception being the Canon R5, which is an excellent camera, which is very quick and keeps up with your subject. So I would recommend, unless you have a Canon R5 or equivalent, I would recommend using single point focus. So you know exactly where you're going to be focusing when you take your photo. There's nothing worse than half pressing your shutter button and you're focusing going off over here in the background and then down here and then over here and then finally on your subject who's moved maybe out of the scene or is too close now or whatever. So using a single point focus is really useful because you say, right, here's my subject, focus, take the photo. If you know that your subject's walking towards you or they're running, they're quite quick, you can focus just in front of them, take your photo. Okay, so by the time you've got your focus, they've moved a little bit closer. When you get your shot, they might then be in your focal plane. Now, this all depends on your aperture value as well. If it's a bright day and you can narrow your aperture, it will give you more in focus to start with. Okay, so you'll help yourself out, especially when you've got these fast moving subjects. Let's see what else we can talk about. So let's talk about background and distractions. So we've got this background here with Molly. I love this pose she does. And so we've got a lot of sand just filling the frame behind them. We've got this green and we've got this red. So your eye does go up to these areas, especially the green, because it's kind of like a newer color introduced into the scene. And it's quite bright up here as well. So you kind of do look at both things compared to if you just filled the frame with just sand, where you don't really have to worry about any distractions anywhere else. You just look at your subject. Now, obviously, we've got this photo in and give us a better composition. But simplicity is really, really powerful in photography. If you can remove background distractions, you can really focus your viewer's eye in on your subject. Okay, so bear that in mind. When you are looking at your subject, think about what's behind. So obviously this is overexposed. But if we compare this one and the framing in the background to this one and the framing in the background, the same shot, might be the same shot, slightly different. This one's got this area up here. So you look at the dog and then you look up here. Okay, whereas if we frame like this, we don't get distracted by what's up here. All right. And obviously we'd edit this one to bring our highlights back, or take the shot, look at it, and then change your exposure settings, which is probably preferable. So again, background distractions. We've got the sign on the rock here, draws your eye. We've got people wearing lots of different colors, draws your eye. And even though they're out of focus, your eye still does go back here. Now, obviously, this is kind of a shot where we're practicing getting the focus as the dog runs towards us. Can you believe how cute she is? It's a really, really sweet shot. She's such a sweet dog as well. There's a little person here too. And then as she gets closer, we are getting less of this in directly behind her. So that's going to allow us to crop in more and just have the sandy background behind her. Yeah, so coming in more, we could crop in closer. She's coming in more. Again, we could crop in closer if she was sharp and if we wanted to use that photo. Then we have this one as well. So she's continuing to run towards us, but now we have these people closer in the frame. They are distracting. So for a portrait of a dog, you would, again, you'd want a simple background like one of these so you can crop in. This is more a portrait of a dog with another dog behind and some people and some other dogs over here as well. So simplifying your picture by just having what you want in your shot and keeping a nice clear background makes all the difference to your photos. Okay, let's have a look at this one. So this one is an example of having a real bright background. The sun is shining off of the water, coming straight into the camera, and it's overexposed, slightly overexposed, because we're exposing for the dogs. They're our subject. This is where we want the exposure. Now, you could, if you wanted to, use a flash and high-speed sync to light the dogs. if you were very lucky, you might get that shot. Now, these guys are quite far away. I'm using a 70 to 200mm lens to photograph them, and they are very fast moving. So using a flash, you'd have to be real lucky with, or have an assistant holding the flash pointing at the dogs as you move. But you do have to bear in mind that because they move so fast, it's almost impossible to get a correctly exposed shot straight out of camera of dogs moving quickly, especially with the flash. Further away they move from the flash, the darker they're going to be. So yeah, it's a real juggling act to work it all together. Now, the beautiful thing about Lightroom is that if you do have a photo like this where your background is a little bit bright, there's still detail in here. We can still see this stuff in the background. We can bring the highlight slider down and get that detail back. So I'm not too worried about it being overexposed. Okay, it's more about the dogs. We want the dogs the correct exposure. Ideally, we would like the dogs to be facing more in this direction where the light is a bit more even, so it's easier to bring those highlights back. But that doesn't always work, and then you don't have all the water droplets in there splashing around, and obviously they weren't doing this and this scene. So just take what you can, and then hopefully Lightroom will allow you to bring back those highlight details later on. It's better to get the shot and to try it. Even if your shot doesn't work, at least you've got it. At least you can try it. So this one probably is a little bit too bright on the dog. She's not particularly sharp anyway, but who knows? You could have got the shot and thought, oh, wow, I really like it and I'm going to use it. But you don't know until you take it. Okay. So again, this one's a little bit better in terms of contrast of the light on the water and then the light on them. So we could probably bring these light levels down, add a bit of clarity and sharpness to the dogs to make them a bit sharper. And you can see that as they ran across the beach with the light behind them, the exposure gets much better on the sand and in the water. So again, light direction, super, super important. Now we do have details in the background now. So people walking on the beach, lifeguard station. This is an Exmouth in South Devon. East Devon? South Devon? South East Devon? One of those. And yeah, we have this bright building over here, which does distract your eye. But again, we can bring those light levels down in the background to bring the focus more on the dogs. It's just kind of getting in what you want in the shot. Now, because they're really out of focus in the background, it helps them be a little bit less distracting than it would be if they were sharp. So using a wider aperture will help with that. So this was shot at f4, which is fairly wide. But also because they're quite far away, you'll find that f4 will give you a fair amount in focus, and we can look at the sand for what's sharp. It's harder with the water, but there's about this much in focus. Yeah, and then you'd use a shutter speed to freeze their movement. So probably could have gone a bit faster with this shutter speed instead of 1/400. You go up to 1,000th, you definitely freeze the movement. But then if you go up to 1,000th, you have to bear in mind your ISO is going to increase, or we'll have to go wider. So just see what you can do. Go out and experiment. See if you can photograph different coloured dogs on the beach. Quite often you can go along and just photograph other people's dogs. So if you haven't got your own dog, or you don't want to have to worry about keeping an eye on your dog when you're shooting, go and just photograph somebody else's. I love this series of Betty. I know the background's super, super blown out, but it was more about capturing her shaking and getting the detail in her. You can put them together later. So this is a good exercise in shutter speed, positioning, and then also just like, I know I'm not going to use these photos for anything because the background is so blown, but it just gives me that idea of if I could shoot this again, but have her like against the cliffs or shooting up the beach where the light is better, then I would definitely do that because it's a really cute series. You kind of need to be stood in like 3 places with dogs because they run so fast around you to get the light right when they're doing something cute is quite tricky, but it's definitely doable. Okay, photographing 2 dogs in the same shot, one light, one dark, really, really tricky. If you have a nice flatly lit day, so if it's cloudy, you'll get a better shot than if the sun's come out. So in this shot, obviously the sun has come out, which is overexposing our white dog, but the black dog actually looks, exposure wise, isn't too bad, but they're not sharp because we're focused on this one. Okay, So appropriate shutter speed is good. This is not a good example of focus or shutter speed, but whatever. So that one's okay for her because she's fairly still. But if you're photographing a dog that's running, you want to use about 1,000th of a second to freeze the movement. Look for your light direction. So here we have a little bit of cloud, which is giving us a better exposure than the previous shots of this dog. Oh, it's just switched, but probably would have been using a what you call it, a picture profile, which adds a little bit of processing in. So if we come over into our develop module in Lightroom, once it's loaded, come on, wake up. We can then bring the highlight slider down and get some detail back in our highlights. Okay, and that's how powerful Lightroom is. It really helps you get that detail back. Okay, so don't worry if you're taking your shots and they look a little bit too bright or a little bit too dark. There is a lot you can do in editing software if you use it. And if you don't use it, you just have to be more precise or just face the way that you know the light is softer so you can get the shots that you want to get. Okay, don't worry if you have, like me in this photo, most of your photos too bright or slightly out of focus. It's about enjoying photography. Have fun with your pets. Just take it for the one shot that you think, okay, cool, this is portfolio worthy, or the person who owns this dog would really like this shot, or I really like this shot of my dog. Okay, don't worry that you've got loads of photos that aren't technically great. It's about practicing. Okay, practice, practice, practice. I'd recommend using, if you've got a fast moving dog, 1,000th of a second, auto ISO, and then let the aperture figure itself out in shutter priority. See how you get on. And it'll be really cool if you post links to your, if you've got a Flickr photo stream or Facebook page and you want to share some of your photos, post them in the comments and we can all have a look. And we can follow each other Instagram as well. Obviously, why did I not think of Instagram? It's a really good place to post your photos. So it'd be cool to see what everybody has got and your dog photos too. And I will talk to you next time. Thanks for watching.